I don't know if you agree.
Well, I agree that we should support those who demand and clearly want human rights wherever they happen to live. That's not quite the same thing as going out like a missionary and convincing people that our idea of what is right should be a universal right. I think those are two different things. So supporting the green movement and so on, absolutely. I think that's absolutely our duty. There's something else you said, though, and which is, I think, also at the core of this discussion, and I don't have a categorical opinion on, because I think it's a very complicated thing, and I'd love to know what the Archbishop thinks, which is that I'm not sure it's right to call somebody's religious faith an intellectual position, because it usually isn't. I think there is a distinction. I think attacking somebody for his political opinions is neither rude nor undesirable. Attacking somebody for his faith or her faith is a somewhat different thing, and I wouldn't ban it by law, but I think in order to have a civilized society there are certain rules of politesse that are desirable. Now, should religion be thought of as a different thing than, say, political opinions? And I think there are arguments that it should, because it's very much, religion is a way, is bound up with people's identities. It's the way they see, that people who have faith feel and see themselves. And to take an example not from religion, if I come to Sweden as a foreigner and I say, I hate Ingmar Bergman's films, that would not be considered to be a particularly rude remark. It might be a little brash, but it's not rude. If I come to Sweden and say, I loathe Sweden, that would certainly be rude, because it would be hurtful to people who are Swedes, who see themselves as Swedes, can't help seeing themselves as Swedes. They are Swedes, it's part of who they are. And I think people who are religious think of themselves in those terms too, in the way that a social democrat or somebody who believes in humanism or communism or something doesn't. It's not quite the same thing.
Well, it's difficult to express these things in a foreign language, because these are very important. I mean, a religious worldview is, of course, an intuitive thing. It's not, you can, through tradition, be taught religion, but that is only on the surface. If you have it as a personal conviction, it's more like intuition. And it has been so from the very beginning. You started and then you have to explain, and you did it through myth and stories, and you got traditions, and then you got power involved and all these things. That is a fascinating thing in itself. But that also means that it is very personal, in the sense that you can never allow a collective to decide what you should feel, because it is an inner thing. It's the withinness of everybody. And sometimes this is very difficult, because you get these traditions, and there are power structures, and you have archbishops and so on deciding. People think that they decide, but of course they don't. And you have books and holy books and everything. And there is an intellectual way. This is where I think what is rational. There's an intellectual way to deal with this, what I have said now, to understand where does it come from, so to speak? What kind of understanding of knowledge do we have in this? So it doesn't mean to be irrational, because you can deal with it in a hermeneutical way to 100%. You try to understand it, but this is how life is presenting itself to me. And I'm trying to respond to it in a responsible way. And I would say that if you have human rights, all these values, they are in the same way also intuitive. That's not a rational thing to say that you have the same value as I have. That is more of a personal intuition. So in that sense, a secular democratic state is close to the religious tradition if you leave fundamentalists outside. You have to realize that the deep personal values, they are not rationally accepted, but it's more than that. But you can deal with them in a rational way. Am I rational now?
No, it's certainly rational. I think probably it's a little bit of both. And and that goes for all feelings of identity, religious or national or anything else. I mean, for example, myself, I haven't lived in my native country, the Netherlands, since 1975. My mother was not even Dutch, but I grew up there. I feel Dutch. I have a Dutch passport. Now, that can be dealt with entirely in rational ways. I can talk about Dutch history, religion, and so on, take a distance from it, write about it, be analytical. But when the Dutch football team play, especially Germany, I can be reduced to tears, which is an entirely irrational response to this. And I think that is why both in terms, when you start to talk to people in terms of their identity, who they think they are, often they are that because they can't help being that. They were born into it. Then you can hurt people because you're touching something which can't be entirely rationalized, unlike a political opinion.
But I'd like to add another dimension to this part of the discussion, which is, I mean, we've discussed making intellectual arguments, interpretations of religion and beliefs. How about artistic interpretations? I mean, you end the book actually by making reference to a statement by Salman Rushdie, who made this distinction between attacking or discussing religious beliefs and attacking believers. I was myself very much involved in the Rushdie campaign as chairman of the Swedish Rushdie Committee. And I learned a lot by that. For instance, I realized that even though I've considered myself a reasonably well-educated intellectual, I hadn't even opened the Quran. And I had to start learning things, which added a lot to my worldview. However, I also learned that the most important aid and help to the Rushdie campaign didn't come from Western-born intellectuals. It came from secular former Muslims who knew the inside story of it all and told us what was the core of that fight. And the most important of those was a Syrian philosopher, Sadiq al-Azm, who has taught philosophy at the University of Damascus and who in 1997 had a 3-day seminar on the Satanic verses. And he wrote an essay which I think is very relevant to this discussion, which we actually published in Swedish as well. The importance of being earnest about the Satanic verses. A pun to Oscar Wilde, another case of censorship. But his case was to remind us as Europeans that a novel which is considered really the prime point of modern European literature, James Joyce's Ulysses, was banned in its country of origin, in Ireland. It was also the case. It was also brought to court in both Britain and the United States, and it was allowed, so to speak, formally in the United States in 1936. And he made the point that what is happening now with novels like the Satanic verses is really the same kind of process. The right to use religious symbols as artistic means of expression, which is really making people with a Muslim background, in that sense, equal to Christians. I mean, we are allowed to use religious symbols, and some of our most important artistic works have a religious connotation, whereas in the Muslim world today, it's still almost impossible. And in that sense, we won the Rushdie case because they were forced to abandon the fatwa, but we lost it, in my opinion, in relation to what people, artists with a Muslim background are actually willing and able to do today. Excuse me for making now a strong statement, but I mean, this is, I just want to add this element to the discussion and to hear your views on this.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in Islamic history, but to say it's still that way today in the Islamic world may not be quite the way to put it, because I think these things go up and down in any tradition, and there have been places and periods in Islamic history where people did write satire and so on and so forth.
Of course, more than in the West, actually.
Probably.
Yes.
So what we're dealing with now is indeed a wave of intolerance and fundamentalism, which is serious. There is a difference, I believe, though, between the Ulysses case and the Satanic Verses, in that the people who wish to ban it, Ireland may be a different case, but in Britain and the United States did not do so on the grounds of blasphemy, I think. I think it was the sexual content of it, which is not quite the same thing. I mean, it's perhaps linked, but...
A few short comments. To me, religion is an artistic expression in a way. I mean, if you try to understand what religious ideas contribute to I think it comes closer to art than to science, for example, and that's very important. And then you have to ask, is there any truth value in art and in stories and so on? That's the first point. The second one is that the religious experience is best caught up in narrations, in stories. So in the narrative, there is this iconic element. And then you, of course, there's not much difference from the gospel stories and the stories about Muhammad and so on, the hadith. And and we cannot avoid imaging things we read. And a narrative is very democratic in the sense that it invites you to be a part of it. And that also changes a bit, and it becomes democratic. Well, what was the third one? I forgot. That was the best one.
Perhaps I could add something to that there is, of course, a difference between the Christian artistic tradition and the traditions of Judaism and Islam, in that that Jews and Muslims traditionally have been terrified of idolatry, and so you were not allowed to depict the human figure, because God, who was invisible, could never be challenged by the idolatry of human figures, and which, of course, if you look at Christian art, is full of idolatry from that point of view. I mean,
from that point of view, but in
well,
theory,
in the sense of even in practice, I would say that the worship of saints is, of course, a form of idolatry, because it's worshipping human beings as sacred figures and sacred icons, and that goes back to, obviously, to pre-Christian days.
But I mean, in a sense, you can also say, shouldn't we worship human beings, all of us? I mean, in a sense, that isn't that human rights, that you see this infinite value in every person? So it might be quite close. And now I forgot my third point. It was that within religious tradition, there is always this negation of everything that is put into statements. I mean, you have it from the prophets 2,700 years ago. I loathe when I look at your religious activities. I want to see life. And you have it in the negative language, the apophatic language, in the mystic tradition, that you have to say no to everything you propose. So in that sense, atheism is also in that sense important for a religious tradition, because the truth cannot be included in statements and in forms and structures. So there must always be a no in order to move ahead in this way.
Just one last question to you. We have 2 minutes left. I mean, you live in, I mean, you're based in Holland. No, not anymore, but you're in New York, sorry. I mean, but you have your origins in Holland, and which means that I'm sure you take a specific interest in the political matters in that country. I mean, the fact that what was considered by me as well as perhaps the most liberal-minded country in Europe has now politicians like Geert Wilders and Pim Fortuyn and the others. I mean, did this come as a total surprise for you?
Not a total surprise, because it's been building up for some years. Since we only have 2 minutes, I won't say too much about it, but all it shows, both in Holland and in Sweden, and I think in Sweden it's less dramatic than in Holland. I mean, you got, what, 5.7% of the vote. But it just shows that even those who think they're the champions of liberalism and broad-mindedness and progress and so on can sometimes overrate themselves.
Thank you very much. And with that comment, we close this session. Thank you.